All right, how's everybody doing out there? Oh, that was weak. Come on. How's everybody doing out there? All right, well, thank you Thank you for all for coming to this panel, implementing inclusive industrial policy. My name is Talman Joseph Smith. I'm an economics reporter with the New York Times, covering labor markets, macroeconomics, and financial markets to the extent they reflect back on those too. But the favorite thing for me to cover is labor markets, and my favorite part of the labor market to cover is the Black community, because it's the community that I'm from, the community that I have the most connection to personally, and it's also at, I think, the crux of a very common discussion in economics, which is this idea of trade-offs. That, ultimately, if you have this going for you, there has to be some negative other thing in another direction. Whether we're talking about inflation and unemployment, whether we're talking about tax policy, there's this very trade-off, zero-sum idea of things. And one of the things I've been pushing myself to do in my reporting recently is to ask, when are those trade-offs real? And then demand very careful distributional management? And when are they just presumed? Because maybe we weren't challenging them and pushing ourselves to do better. And I think we've seen during this administration an attitude that is being tested, but that certainly is bold, of there doesn't necessarily need to be a huge trade-off, that we can grow the economy and have everybody do better, that the Black community doing better and the Black community receiving support doesn't have to come at the cost of our international competitiveness as an economy, of the domestic economy growing in general. And so with that, I wanted to kick it over to our panelists here, who are doing amazing work from very different vantage points that touch on exactly that. So if I can start with you, Talisha. Should I introduce you, or should we go the other way around? I'll do it, okay. So we have Talisha Bekavac. She is the Executive Vice President at the U.S. Black Chambers. We also have Joelle Gamble, Deputy Director at the National Economic Council. We have Stephanie Sykes, Special Assistant to the President for the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. And of course, we have the Director of the Economic Policy Institute's Program on Race, Ethnicity, and the Economy, Dr. Valerie Wilson. Dr. Valerie Wilson, I'll start with you, since I started off with sort of a wonky econ question. You, throughout your career, have been fighting against some presumptions that in order for the economy to do well, or maybe for us to have price stability, for inflation to be low, Black unemployment may need to be higher. Right now, we're here talking about industrial policy, inclusive industrial policy. Is there a trade-off between industrial policy being inclusive and also being effective? The biggest criticism that we've seen so far of progressive industrial policy ideas is that, well, if you try to have these diversity initiatives paired with these broader goals of being competitive with China, of rebuilding the industrial base, that ultimately you'll falter or find all these inefficiencies, and projects will be backed 5-10 years out because you can't actually find the best candidate because companies are distracted with these other ideas of DEI and whatnot. How do you address those ideas and push back against them?
So first of all, thank you to the Joint Center for the opportunity to participate in this discussion today. And the first response I would have to that question is that, you're starting with an assumption that inequality is efficient. If you think that there's a trade-off between equity and implementing industrial policy in a way that helps to grow the economy. I think that's absolutely false. In particular, when we think about the kinds of investments that we're looking at now, investments that would benefit climate, global climate, addressing global climate change, addressing the infrastructure concerns of our economy, a lot of the jobs created in those kinds of investments would be jobs in industries like manufacturing and construction. Historically, opportunities in those industries have been widely accessible to communities of color, and in particular black workers and black workers without a college degree. So I would argue that the kind of industrial policy investments that we're talking about now are well situated to have an equitable impact. I would also say that it's not a given that those things would be equitable, that there are steps that need to be taken to make sure that people have adequate access to those opportunities. And I think there are important steps to take to make sure that those are good jobs as well, not just that we're adding jobs, that we're employing more people, that we're employing more black workers specifically, but the jobs that people are getting are actually good jobs.
Thank you. And Talisha, I want to go right to you because of my misunderstanding of whether I was going to introduce you or whether we were all, we were going to do the panel introductions ourselves. I'm sorry about that. So let's center you as a market participant and as a crucial leader in sort of black corporate America. We know that black businesses already struggle to have equity in terms of access to capital in normal times. Now we're in an environment where the cost of capital is higher, which could present an even greater challenges for businesses of people of our background. What are the opportunities so far that you're seeing in terms of the Biden administration's industrial policy that may alleviate some of that? Or is it still a struggle?
Well, thank you as well to my colleague and friend Jessica and to the Joint Center for having us here today. The U.S. Black Chambers is the largest national association representing black-owned businesses in the country. Our headquarters is here in Washington, D.C., but we have over 160 local chapters all around the country, in Africa and the Caribbean and Canada, with a membership base of about 380,000 black-owned businesses. And so we really feel like we've got our finger on the pulse of the black business community. And as we talk about industrial policy and how to be, how for it to be successful for black-owned businesses, what we've been saying since 2020, since COVID, is that black business policy needs to be based in three things: intentionality, transparency, and accountability. And we say that because you've heard previous panelists, and you'll hear today, about the historical investment by the Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the CHIPS Act, with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There's going to be more money spent on what we call shovel-ready jobs than any time in my history. But today, and we thank you to the Biden administration for finally declassifying the data, because now what we know is that of the $9 trillion that's spent in federal contracting, only 1.67% goes to black-owned businesses. And many of you were at the Congressional Black Caucus, and we heard the president tout the $100 million spent with black-owned businesses. But what is $100 million to $9 trillion? And so what we really encourage the administration to do is to continue to utilize the 8A program, but also understand that the 8A program has its challenges. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the 8A program, the 8A program was created to help agencies find small businesses, because you hear this across public and private sector: oh, we do more business with black-owned firms if we can find ones with the size and scale. And so the 8A program takes away that excuse, and it authorizes the SBA to clear these businesses that have size and scale and give them a period of time to get set-aside contracts. But that program, just recently, in June, was brought to court in Tennessee, and the United States lost that case, and the 8A program has now been severely disrupted, where you can no longer use race as a disqualifier or a justifier of discrimination, which we know is the main reason for discrimination, is race. And so we are hoping that we can improve the 8A program and continue to use it as a vehicle for black-owned businesses to be found. But we also have to understand that we have a long way to go. And as we look at this historical spend, we have to ensure that this is going to our community, because as my colleague from the Brookings Institution said, black employers hire black people. We provide over 1 million jobs in this country. And so this is an economic conversation about how we can hire our own community, stand up our own businesses, and really take economic advantage of this historical spending. But it starts with the transparency of knowing where we are at 1.67 and saying, how can we do better in ensuring that with this historical spend that there's equity for black-owned businesses.
To your point, it is truly historical spending. The IRA, $891 billion plus, depending on how the tax credits play out. CHIPS, $280 billion, and then the bipartisan infrastructure funds, $1 trillion or $500 billion, depending on whether you count the transportation that was already within there as a part of the $1 trillion. Nevertheless, a large amount, a lot of it to be dispersed, a lot of it already dispersed. So with that, I turn to you, Joelle, and to you, Stephanie. Give yourselves, as part of the government, a grade so far in terms of how it's been going and in the plans for the rest of the implementation of these funds.
Did you want one of us to start first, or I'm happy to go first?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead. Sure. So also want to thank the Joint Center, Jessica, for bringing us all together here today. I'm happy to be here and to be in conversation with my fellow panelists. So I cover manufacturing supply chain policy at the White House, and so talking about what we've been terming industrial policy is a lot of what I get to do on a day-to-day basis. But before I answer your question, I do remember it. I did want to talk about the term. So we're just saying the word industrial policy, and that has meaning to some people, it doesn't have meaning to other people, right? For those where it has meaning, there's a lot of baggage. And the way I think about it is that it's a pillar of the president's agenda to build the economy from the middle out and bottom up. There's a way to think about industrial policy that is just, let's just subsidize a lot of spending in key sectors, right? Let's just subsidize key actors because we care about global competitiveness in a very, abstract, almost indifferent sense. But the president is taking a different approach, and he's getting criticized for it in some ways. His approach is really focused on making sure that these investments help everyone. It is not an easy thing to do. We're definitely bumping up against barriers, but that is the ultimate goal. Why? Because investing in critical industries is important because the private sector won't do it on its own, right? So that's the first market failure we have to solve for. We care about it also being innovative, and oftentimes there's a lot of risk that you cannot account for, that the private sector is not willing to take on. So we have to solve for that. That's another market failure where the public sector is important. And then you have to also invest in infrastructure and communities themselves, which we definitely know there's not enough investment happening in the market by itself in communities that need support. And he's doing so in a way that's focused on good paying union jobs, right? He's doing so in a way that's focused on communities that are often underinvested in. There's an economic return to that. It's also the right thing to do. He's doing it in a way that's promoting competition, which is also not inherently going to happen because there's a lot of big firms who are the first in line to get tax credits, and so we have to pay attention to the medium-sized businesses and to the small businesses, actually, that are so important to our industrial base. Small and medium-sized enterprises are 98% of output in the manufacturing space, right? So that's absolutely important. So I say that because the top-line term could just sound like anything. But in reality, there is a real strategic vision that involves doing these investments in an inclusive way because we don't think that there are inherent trade-offs to being inclusive and growing the economy, to being inclusive and becoming globally competitive. So I just wanted to kind of level set there. Now, in terms of how it's going, we're seeing some good signs of progress, right? We're seeing it in the top-level data. So we're seeing, foreign direct investment in the United States is nearly double of what's pre-pandemic average in manufacturing. That's part of what the president says when he says we're done exporting jobs and importing products. We want to import jobs and export products, right? We're seeing real construction spending on manufacturing facilities really boom. It had the largest contribution to GDP on record, actually, last quarter. And so we're seeing these top-level signs, but now the real challenge is getting down to the details and making sure that all of that spending is reaching everyone, which is why we're so focused on making sure that when the federal government is buying things, that's federal purchasing power, that's $600 billion a year, that it's going to small businesses, but it's also going to businesses that are owned by people of color. So the $163 billion of annual spend goes to small businesses, but we have to keep getting down and disaggregating the data, as my co-panelists noted, that's important. So that's one thing that we have to do from the federal purchasing power side. But at the same time, a lot of this money is going to the private sector, right? So we also have to make sure that we are pushing the people who are getting these dollars to also have that same goal, to diversify their own supplier base. And that's something we're doing right now. We're pushing the private sector to commit to the same goal the federal government has, which is 15% of those dollars need to go to small and disadvantaged businesses. And the percentage is important, I will say, because if you're just talking about dollars, okay, let's say you're a really, really large company. $1, one level amount is only so much, but if you have a percentage, then the commitment grows with the company, right? And so things like that are where we're really, really focused, because we've gotten this historic legislation passed, but the details, right? Getting over these historic barriers that have been long-standing, challenging, holding back black entrepreneurship, right? Holding black workers from really important job opportunities. We have to keep systematically breaking those down, and that's how you get into the details. And happy to talk more about those details, but I don't want to talk too long.
No, that was absolutely perfect and really, really informative. Stephanie, how about you pick it up from what you talked about in terms of making sure that it reaches every nook and cranny of the country, which is where you live?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my role in the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, I lead the local portfolio, so that's engagement with mayors across the country, city councils, making sure that local leaders understand all of these amazing things that my colleagues on this stage have mentioned to you. And I come to this role, and I think this is important to share with you, that I don't enter the White House any day not with an awareness of who I am, where I've come from a middle-class family, being an African-American woman with 2 African-American children, and how I really care about their communities. And all of that is economics, but also economics and their status will affect their lifelong outcomes. And coming to this work, I had previously co-founded the African-American Mayors Association, and the reason I co-founded that organization is because I fundamentally believe in the power of collective voice to come together to really demand the resources we need. But what's great with the Biden-Harris administration is that you don't have to demand, we're putting it out there. So what we're asking of everyone here is to tell us how we can do better. But I want to share a couple things. We have a playbook for you. We have lots of resources. We're getting out there every day. We're calling folks, we're convening people. Now that we're post-COVID, we're bringing folks to the White House. We want to hear from you. We want to amplify your stories. I think we don't know what we don't know as an administration. And then I noticed when I was in my role in the African American Mayors Association, and sometimes when I speak to smaller communities, they don't know what they don't know, right? So when I'm meeting with a small town mayor, and I'm very intentional about doing that because sometimes our folks don't always get the meetings, I'm calling them to ask them to come meet with us, they'll show up with a notebook asking me, what programs do you have? I have a problem. How can you help me solve it? And I'm happy to do that. But let me tell you, the well-resourced communities come to me and say, here's the problem, this is how I plan to solve it, here are my 5 letters from my whole congressional delegation, it's in a nice, fancy PowerPoint, so I'm just letting you know this is happening. Stark difference. And so what this administration is doing is making sure that the folks that need these resources the most get them. It's not a contest of just who has the best consultants to write the applications, and we're putting out so many technical resources. We have a playbook for every single program we mentioned. The President's Investing in American agenda, we'll hear all these acronyms and all of those things, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, you can go on the website. I know it seems very simple to say, but literally, bookmark, whitehouse.gov, bookmark, bill.gov, bookmark, cleanenergy.gov, because we are literally telling you it's a cheat code for the test. But I understand you have a lot of things to do. Our communities are under-resourced, they're understaffed. They come to us uniquely situated. Sometimes the very first of, even in communities like Montgomery, you still have the first Black mayor. You still have the first that we're just leading. And the other challenge that we also are very cognizant of is just the natural differences between state and local government. Sometimes we have a lot of blue communities and red seas, but some of the things we're doing is making sure that while some of these programs are directly funded to states, there's still competitive opportunities across all of these programs. So I always think that we can do more, but we also have to hear from each and every one of you. When we put out those Federal Register notices, reply. When we do a webinar and there's an opportunity for questions, we read those. Please tweet. We don't know what we don't know. So that goes on both sides, and we're here to help, both my Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. So if you have a local leader, state local leader, they should be reaching out to my office. And then there's the Office of Public Engagement that's led by Steve Benjamin, that many of you know. And that office deals with everyone that's not an elected official, so our community colleges, our HBCUs, our corporations. So you also have to know where to go, and we are here every day. And this administration has been very intentional, and the number of Black appointees is historic, and we work together, both intentionally, also ad hoc, calling each other to make sure that we're getting all the resources to you. So let us know. We're here, and we want to be your partner.
Hearing how hard you're working, I know my taxpayer dollars and everybody else's taxpayer dollars here are really getting a bang for their buck. So, thank you for all of that. To give greater context to this, I wanted to both Talisha and Dr. Wilson pivot to the past and also look to the future. One of the reasons we're here talking about industrial policy, right? Why is that? It's because of de-industrialization, right? The 40 to 50 year, depending on your timeline, de-industrialization of America, particularly the core of America. And Dr. Wilson, I was reading The Unwinding by George Packer, which is a book from 2013 that got a lot of praise because it showed across the years the deindustrialization of this country, and it focused on Youngstown, Ohio. And I think part of what Packer did that was a service as the star of those chapters in Youngstown, Ohio, is actually a black woman and her family. And I think that was important, and I think a lot of the work you've been doing is important, because I think the face of deindustrialization, for somewhat understandable reasons, for a long, long time, and even today, is a white man with a hard hat. And that white man with a hard hat is an American citizen. He's an important person. His family's important. His family is also, our brothers and sisters. And yet, there has been a lack of focus on the fact that Black people and Black communities have long been manufacturing workers too. And as we look forward and we think about our modern American cities, Talisha, there is a concern, as you've pointed out, that we'll have this great renewal on paper overall in the sort of construction and manufacturing data, but it might mean less, and it will be less equitable if our community is not also included. So I want to go to you second, but Dr. Wilson, can you take us back to the 70s, to the 80s, where this all started, this sort of despair, and sort of connect it both to the economic data, but also the reality that oftentimes in econ and in politics, which are more connected than we think, decisions from those on top really can just trickle down in unexpected ways.
Sure, and I'm not even going to go as far back as the 70s and 80s. We can look at what happened in this country between 1998 and 2021 in terms of loss of manufacturing jobs. Over that period of time, there were nearly 5 million manufacturing jobs lost in this country. About 70,000 manufacturing plants closed. When you talk about what impact that had on Black workers in particular, the job loss to Black workers in that time was about 650,000 jobs. That's about a 30% decline in Black workers' share of manufacturing employment. What we had seen prior to that period is that the Black workers' representation in the manufacturing industry was roughly on par with Black workers' representation in the workforce overall. So as we saw manufacturing jobs increase, there was a proportionate share going to African Americans. As we started to experience this period of loss of manufacturing jobs, largely due to mismanaged global competition, we started to see increasingly that the share of Black workers in manufacturing was falling behind our share of the workforce overall. Now, I talked about that 650,000 job loss. That is a big number that, on its own is a shocking number. But when we talk about the significance of losing manufacturing jobs in particular, we have to consider, as I was referencing before, the value and quality of those jobs. This was significant because those were good-paying jobs in a highly unionized industry that were accessible to people beyond those without a college degree. So they were widely accessible to many people in the economy. They were unionized jobs, so people were able to earn more in that industry than they would in comparable industries. Just to put a number on that, black workers in the manufacturing industry at the median, again for a non-college educated worker, earned about $5,000 more per year in manufacturing than in non-manufacturing industries overall as an average. Now, again, the impact of those losses, we have to consider, well, what replaced those jobs? And over that period, the majority of jobs that were being gained as those manufacturing jobs were going away were lower wage jobs in the service sector industry, again, an industry with much lower rates of unionization. And so when we look at that sort of dynamic, what was lost and what replaced it, we see a broader impact even. You talked about Youngstown. If we look in the Midwestern region of this country, we consider the average black-white wage gap. At one point, you talked about, starting in the 70s and 80s. In the early 1980s, the black-white wage gap in the Midwestern region of this country was as close to parity as it's been anywhere in the country. As we saw these job losses taking place, that gap widened to a level that is pretty much equal to what we would see in the South, which historically has had the largest black-white wage gap. So not only are we talking about loss of jobs and an individual impact to those families, but it's a measurable impact in terms of how we measure racial equality and economic outcomes, specifically in wages in this country.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. So, Talisha, I feel like that's a perfect cue for you and the work that you've been doing. Can you bring us like a few examples to sort of make this more concrete of how in practice, right, a more active government, a more creative government supporting business, particularly black business, what that looks like, both in terms of the hope that you've seen so far and when you look at things and you think, okay, well, this would be much more effective if we tweak things that way or the other way in terms of going forward. Because you're from Atlanta, I'm from New Orleans. Atlanta's doing a little bit better than New Orleans right now, but there are these great cities, and not just cities, right, counties across the country that we really want the best for, and getting it right matters.
Well, I'll say that when we talk about manufacturing, I think your point about the face of manufacturing is so interesting because there was a study that came out with one of our partner organizations, Women Impacting Public Policy, and black women are leading our community in business creation and with being employers. And the industries where we are leading, retail and the beauty industry. And when you think about my black women in the audience, I mean, you all know how our journey is with finding these products for our natural hair. And you mix a little bit of leave-in with some gel, and and you're manufacturing your own natural hair care products. But this has been the frontier of an entire new industry for black women, and it's in the manufacturing space. And you all may have seen a very big exit by Mael to Procter & Gamble, multi-billion-dollar acquisition that was done by Mael because she created and manufactured her own hair care product and did an exit that was on the front page of Essence magazine. And so I think it's just important to understand, again, the intentionality of how black people and black business owners, how we bring our ingenuity to these different industries. And then we have to ensure that they are well capitalized. There was a young lady, Lamique Beauty. We have been helpful to her in providing capital and getting some grants through our partners. But she talks about how she was trying to manufacture her own hair care product because of her breast cancer issues with her mom and how her mom ended up having breast cancer. And I just heard on the radio this morning that the FDA is finally outlawing formaldehyde in hair straightener. Because guess what? Come on, somebody. Hair straighteners and perms all these years, now we know they cause cancer. So now we know why we have more fibroids than other communities, because we've been getting our hair straightened. And so when we think about manufacturing and how that applies to the Black community, we just have to be creative. We have to change the narrative, and then we have to tell stories. Storytelling is so important. It's why we've we've acquired the National Association of Black-owned Broadcasters, because we need to tell our stories. We need people to understand that the face of manufacturing is different. It is of all shades, it's of all colors, it's of all genders. And then we have to ensure that these businesses are well capitalized. And so to my friends at the Small Business Administration and to other entities, we have to be intentional with some of the questions that even go into getting an SBA grant. We worked with the SBA to eliminate over 100 duplicative questions in certain processes just because they were racist or discriminatory. Why do you need to know if I have a criminal record if I'm trying to start a business? If my business plan is good, then it shouldn't matter if I have a criminal record, because we know that Black folks have disproportionately been impacted by the criminal justice system. And so let that be separate. If I've got a great business idea, let me get the capital that I need to be a job creator in my community. And so again, we're going back to intentionality, transparency, and accountability specific to Black folks. And then to my colleague Stephanie, who shared her resources, to all of you all who are out there in the audience that are business owners, we are working very closely with the federal government and all state and local governments on your behalf to help them find you. Because they say that we can't find Black-owned businesses that can handle a $1 trillion contract with the defense company. Yes, you can. You can find them, because we've found them through our certification tool, Buy Black, BYBLACK.us. We have taken away the barrier that we hear from both the public and the private sector that we don't exist, because we do exist. And we are making economic impact, and we're contributing to the bottom line in our communities and to the greater GDP. And so BYBLACK.us, if you are 51% Black owned, please go get certified so that we can find you. We can help match you with both public sector buyers, and we have over 100 corporate partners that have committed to supporting Black-owned businesses, and we're holding them accountable. We don't want to know how much you spent with minority businesses. We want to know how much you spent with Black-owned businesses. And I'm going to leave it there.
Hear, hear. To your point, Talisha, about these presumptions, one of the things I've covered recently is the official data showing that, there's 2 jobs for every 1 person unemployed. And I tried to interrogate that data, by asking, well, then how is it that 1 in 3 people that have been recently incarcerated are unemployed, looking for work, not finding it? And so I think that point is very well taken and not wrestled with enough. You also brought up the fact that while Black women may not be, in general, right, like at the heart of some of these manufacturing sectors, that it's important to realize that they're at the forefront of business creation often. And that reminded me of a general point that I think about in my work, which is that when the more sectors that you have running hot, whether it's retail, hospitality, et cetera, that puts pressures on all employers to be more fair in terms of who they're going to hire, when they're going to hire them, and the compensation at which they're going to be hired at. And Joelle, I am a hard news reporter that has no opinions, supposedly. But one thing that I think was very brave of this administration was to say, you know what, we're going to run the economy hot. We know we just got out of a pandemic, that we had the Ukraine war, and that we also have had some corporate profiteering that has made things more expensive across the last couple of years. But that's not an excuse to not push for greater employment, to not push for greater Black employment, to not push for better unionization. And of course, I think as we're talking about all these things, what's looming is the strikes that we've been seeing, right? The summer of strikes, many of which are continuing. Can you talk a bit about how the administration pairs sort of pro-social, pro-minority, pro-Black policy with these sort of wonky labor issues in terms of union fights, maybe the PRO Act, things like that?
Yes, could you just restate the question? You're asking how we pair pro-social policy with labor negotiations, or could you
Well,
just?
of course, you all aren't doing the labor negotiations, but I mean, the President Biden has said that he wants to be the most pro-union president. How does he connect ideas like that? How do you all connect the analysis that you all do at the NEC and just the general support of the economy that you're going for with these broader ideas? Like basically connecting the idea of inclusive industrial policy with unionization. How crucial are unions
Yeah,
to
I think
these
it's because
goals?
we think they're all the same thing. That's why it's kind of like, I don't.
No, that's
see
a good answer.
Right, and that's because, and I think frankly a lot of the work we're doing builds on a lot of the research that's been done by folks, including folks on the stage, like Dr. Wilson, on the importance of, inclusivity, worker power to getting to better economic outcomes. As she mentions at the front, we don't think there's an inherent trade-off between addressing inequality and growing the economy. We actually think that addressing inequality is important for growing the economy. And you see this in research, right? So for the San Francisco Fed, for example, I think it was a paper in 2019, excuse me if I get too wonky, I tend to go down these kind of number-driven rabbit holes, but they did a study where they looked at if you close just the labor market gaps by race and gender, what would happen? And you would add $3 trillion to US GDP, right? And so they're not in tension. They actually need to go together. In fact, reducing inequality is critical to growing the economy. And this is important when we talk about unions as well. The Treasury Department under President Biden just put out a report maybe a few weeks ago, talking about the economics of unions, right? We know that unions are important for the workers who are within unions. It helps to close wage gaps by race for workers in unions. It helps those workers see a rise in their wages, right? That's called a premium. So they're getting a premium over other workers in that industry for being in a union. It helps them with voice. It helps them get better benefits. It even helps with labor law enforcement. So unions can be really, really helpful for the workers that are in them. Unions are also helpful for the workers who are not in them. There are what are called spillover effects, right, to other workers in that industry, because now they've got to compete with this shop over here that's got better jobs, frankly. And then on top of that, there's an important thing that unions do for the overall economy, which is to help reduce inequality, which gets back to the overall goal that I was saying before, that reducing inequality is good for growth. And that's central to the president's vision for actually growing the economy from the middle out and the bottom up, which he says very, very often.
Well, hey, we've been talking about recession or an oncoming recession for a while, but here we are not in a recession, and according to your point, the latest numbers, we may get a GDP handle of 5%. GDP growing at 5% on a quarterly basis, which we would not have seen anywhere from 2004, I think, until about 2020. So even as we wrestle with all the big structural issues that we've been talking about, things seem like they're going pretty well so far for y'all. To that point, Stephanie, as we close out, and then I want to wrap up with you, Dr. Wilson, a sort of similar question for both of y'all. First, Stephanie, from your vantage point, as we look out 5-10 years and connect what the federal government has done in the past 3 years, past 2.5 years or so, to the results on the local and the state level, how do you grade it, right? How will we know that these early efforts will have created fruits?
No, absolutely. So these are the most historic investments since Eisenhower. We have money going to bridges, to internet. You can get free internet. I don't know if you know, getinternet.gov. It's not falling out of the sky. That's a very intentional program from the federal government. So we're going to see those people that benefit from those programs having access to school, to telehealth, to e-commerce, and all the things that we saw in the pandemic was very difficult for our communities. I think there are a lot of programs, and I know we're out of time, so I won't go through all of them, but within each of the major Invest in America agenda programs, there are intentional programs directed to our communities. So in the bipartisan infrastructure law, if you talk about reconnecting communities, it is righting the wrongs of highways that went through Black communities by giving funding to build bridges to economic opportunities to downtown areas or other places we can get jobs. So the challenge we have is you don't build a bridge overnight, so that is going to be that 5-year outlook that we're going to see if we can come together and be intentional, that there will be historic changes in our communities that were put together by this administration that have just been unprecedented. And I just want to say one thing on the unions too, that I think we're also very intentional on the engagement side that historically, I think the elephant in the room is we didn't think unions were for us. They often didn't look like us. The union leaders often did not look like us. I'm from a middle-class, blue-collar area in Philadelphia, the suburbs. Like, I didn't think a union was for me. I mean, so I think we're also really being intentional about apprenticeship programs. We see Mayor Brandon Scott in Baltimore putting a project labor agreement with his transportation projects. So I'm very hopeful. And I think in 5 and 10 years, we'll see that it was this administration that put these historic programs that not only just transformed communities, also transformed Black communities.
Thank you. And now, Dr. Wilson, for you. We'll just pretend like Stephanie and Joelle aren't here, since they're part of the administration. You, as our objective economist here on stage, how do you think the administration's doing, and will this bear fruit?
So pretending they're not on the stage, I would say that I do think the administration is doing well on this front, and as they've used the word historic many times, yes, it's absolutely a historic investment. I think currently, where the economy is in terms of the labor market, we are seeing historically low rates of Black unemployment. We don't have equal unemployment yet, but the gap has narrowed, and I think that is due largely to, one, a lot of the decisions made by the administration in terms of how they address the pandemic and helping us to have a rapid recovery that really reached all communities fairly quickly, as well as the impact that monetary policy has played in keeping us at a tight labor market and as close to full employment economy as we can have. And so I think these investments are important. I think it's important to recognize that they are still ongoing. They will continue to roll out. And so as we move forward, it's even more important that we are collecting the kind of data and information that allows us to evaluate how equitable and inclusive these investments have been in the long term.
Well, on that very well-rounded note, how about we thank our panelists, our brilliant panelists. And thank you to the Joint Center again. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Oh, do we have time for a Q&A? We do? Okay, I didn't know. We have to.
Exactly one question. It's lunchtime, y'all.
All right, so I was wrong on timing. We have time for exactly one question. You, sir? Please.
So, I've been in architecture and urban design for 45 years, especially on Black and brown communities. And so for me, the Biden administration has created a huge opportunity to make the investment. But how is the Black community going to design the deal that takes advantage of the capital that they put forward? For example, Justice 40 prioritizes investments into underserved communities. And my experience has been our communities leave money on the table because we don't design the deal, just like Stephanie talked about when the other companies come in with their PowerPoints. And so to me, we have an opportunity to figure out how are we going to design a deal that creates the right economic chemistry that rebuilds the infrastructure in existing old Black communities so that those communities can grow to new development. That's the next generation we have to figure out, because basically cities are asking for repairs for deferred maintenance, which is what Mitch Landry's pointing out he doesn't want cities to do. They want you to design what the future is going to be, and that's a series of facilities, and then say to the administration, how do we use the money that they've allocated? Otherwise, the white communities are just going to take the money and put it into deferred maintenance. So my question to the panel is, have we figured out what that deal is?
I feel like that's for somebody in the administration.
I don't think I have the whole question, and I know I don't want to ever talk before people need to eat, but just briefly, there are a lot of resources. I'll just go back to the resource point, which is the bipartisan infrastructure law made the Minority Business Development Agency a permanent agency in the federal government. Never was permanent before. We have a fabulous undersecretary, and there is a capital readiness program. So if you're talking about capital, that is also something that there are resources for. They administered a lot of grants this summer, and so it's not just about the small business, it's also scaling to the next level, and there are minority business development centers in every state, I believe, that can also support businesses that are trying to scale and grow and to answer some of those design questions. And then on the manufacturing part, in the Commerce Department, the National Institute of Science and Technology, NIST that we call it, they have manufacturing centers, as we talk about manufacturing, to provide some of those same resources. So just wanted to share that with you. So NIST.gov and MBDA.gov as well to point you to some resources.
And the U.S. Black Chamber.
Yeah,
We are,
of course.
we are one of the recipients of the Capital Readiness Program that Stephanie just mentioned, and as you heard, we've done our own M&A deal in the acquisition of the National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters. It took us 4 years to get that deal done, and we did it to show that in the Black community, we have to make 1 + 1 = 11. So we welcome you to follow us online, usblackchambers.org, because we have been really getting focused on technical assistance around deal origination, M&A, how to put a deal stack together, a capital stack together, because, to take advantage of these historic investments, you might not be able to go it alone. You may have to build a joint venture or do an acquisition or do a merger so that we can present ourselves as competitive.
Here, here. So before there was a false alarm, so now let's have an even bigger round of applause for our brilliant panelists. Thank you again to the Joint Center.